I apologize that we had made a change to the original format of this particular event. We do FirstTalk events quite often, but this is one of the first ones we've done sort of post-COVID. So it was interesting because we had several of the attendees that were invited to ask about a virtual format opportunity. And with that, we had confirmed at Perry's Steakhouse, and they did, require a minimum of attendees. So we decided to pull this out of a in-person format and work with our subject matter experts here that are on the screen with me tonight, and to go through a conversation of the topic that we had originally scheduled to do in person with you. So really the topic that is very, very prominent on so many board members' minds is, when a crisis happens, how do we plan for it? So really, when you think about what the responsibilities are of the board of directors, it is really the fiduciary responsibility of the board. One of the highlight areas is really the insurance coverage. And so our experience at First Service Residential, we've had, some great opportunity of case study, and one that you probably could not create, to do any kind of a test, if you will. So water events certainly happen within the high-rise properties, but when it becomes more of a catastrophic type of event, whether it's a garage collapse or an evacuation of a full building, or if there is damage to the building that affects the majority of the residents, the question, becomes, how do we react, and are we prepared? So the insurance policy practices, very, very important. How does the Texas Uniform Condominium Act play into how the board reacts and handles an event? How does the board prepare financially, right? What are those recovery options depending on the magnitude of the event? How do we look really at a property and proactively plan for? Because as we say, it's not a matter of if, but it's a matter of when something may happen at a property that we really want our board of directors to be prepared. So what is that crisis plan? How do we make sure that, when the clock starts ticking, that we aren't asking a lot of questions at that time, but we're prepared? So I'm very fortunate to be joined this evening with several individuals who bring a tremendous amount of expertise in their field. And I'm going to ask each one of them to introduce themselves, really what their field of expertise is, and really to give you an idea of what they are going to bring to the table this evening. And I think we're going to start out with Jamie George.
Thank you, Susan. It's such a pleasure to be here tonight. So as Susan put, I am Jamie George. I am Vice President of Insurance for First Service Financial. And my role is to help our managed clients with those insurance policies, with finding the correct brokers and helping them ensure that they have, their gaps covered, that they have what they need in place.
Great. Following that, Carla Chung.
Terrific. Good evening, everyone, and happy to be here as well. My name is Carla Chung. I am Vice President at First Service Financial, covering the Cash Management Division, which encompasses anything having to do with assisting associations with their investments and with their lending needs. I have helped a few high-rise properties over the years in terms of when they've come through different catastrophic events, and just assisting with kind of emergency lines and things of that nature. So thanks again.
Okay, and Dee Dee, you're up next.
Thank you, Susan. Hello, everybody. I'm Dee Dee Dochin, and I'll be speaking from the perspective of crisis communications and crisis management. I'll be talking about not just what to do when something happens, but what to do before anything happens. And I'm happy to be here with you.
Great, thank you, Dee Dee. Jonathan Henley.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Henley. I'm with Arthur J. Gallagher. We are an insurance broker. We work with First Service on condominiums in Texas and several other states. Also here from Gallagher is Sarah Mahalchik, who we work together on the condominium team. Together, we do a very large number of condominiums, particularly in Houston and in Austin, and have a lot of experience. But our role is to help the condominiums find the most favorable coverage terms, pricing possible. And then we're also there to assist when things do go wrong, when there is a crisis, when there is a very large claim. And we're also there to help facilitate communication between the association and the unit owners, because oftentimes there's a lot of confusion about who's covering what and how those two policies interplay with one another.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and hello, Sarah. Harley.
Good evening. My name is Harley Janice. I'm the regional vice president for First On Site. We'll be speaking from the perspective of disaster restoration and reconstruction, and here to answer questions on best practices and what to expect. So looking forward to speaking with everybody.
Thank you, Harley. And Emily.
Hi, this is Emily Cokwell. I look forward to being with you tonight. I am a senior production underwriter with Affiliated FM, which is a large commercial property carrier, in one of the FM Global companies. So if there's any questions about property coverage, I can help answer those.
Perfect. And then from the First Service residential side, we have a couple individuals with us, which I think would be, a great resource to talk about boots on the ground. Sean Bell is our regional director of the high-rise division for Austin. And before he had that role, he was the general manager at the Austonian for a significant amount of time. And so has some great insight to sort of what happens at the moment and how do we organize that communication to the residents, to the media, which Dee Dee will help us with, and then really how to communicate and organize the capture of the loss. And so Sean will be a very integral part of the conversation this evening as well. And then Rodney Riepenhoff is our regional director of facility management for the high-rise division for the whole state of Texas. And what I think will be interesting if we start with Rodney this evening, only because I think we almost have to back into when a crisis happens, when an event happens. And so when we really think about an event happening in a property, it's important that the on-site management team is proactive as possible to prevent an event from happening. So I'm going to let Rodney talk a little bit about how it's important for property managers or for board of directors to look at how do we manage our properties from the inside out, right? How do we really take a look at the property and the what if statement that might happen, and how to maybe make sure that everything's in place to perhaps avoid an event. So Rodney, I'm going to actually let you get started this evening.
Wow, I get to go first. That's amazing. Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for that great introduction, Susan. One of the things that we learned and what Susan kind of spoke about is really backing up and starting before a catastrophic event, and how that really looks, and how your on-site team, how a building really needs to take a step back and review certain things. And a lot of that has to do with what I will say, condition of your equipment, making sure that preventative maintenance is done, that, your Your on-site team is touching that on a daily basis. They're checking the equipment, they're inspecting piping, and they are using, logs and documentation that really, when it comes down to an insurance claim, plays a big role in that. And then the next piece is making sure that you have an emergency preparedness protocol, and making sure that you have these procedures in place and that you've trained on them. We do a lot of training in our buildings. We do a lot of this type of work to be prepared for it. And I always say it sometimes comes to to the change of you really sometimes can't prepare for everything, but certainly if you have very good procedures in place and you've trained your staff, the response time is what's really critical. So I'd have to say that that's probably the biggest thing that we really work on, is that emergency response team.
So one of the things that we do at First Service Residential, we have a proprietary system called the DOT system. And maybe, Rodney, I think this would be a good time just to sort of chat about that a little bit. And, this is just an example of training the staff on site in the event, because as immediate response is absolutely critical.
Yes. So, we've developed that over the last 10 years and continued to, modify it and improve it as, technology has come out, and so what happened was, and it was a great case study 10 years ago. We had a high rise, that 25th floor sprinkler head burst. And it was 25 minutes by the time our on-site staff figured out what was going on. The fire department had arrived. Everybody is looking. And by that time, we had water literally running out the front door. And we knew we needed to have some type of system put into place to cut that time down, because once we went through all of the insurance, the mitigation, all of that stuff, that added up to about $75,000 a minute on that water loss. So we came up with the DOT system. The DOT system is very simple. You can take someone from off the street that's never been into your building, walk them into the front desk, tell them that they have a major water leak. They can literally undock an iPad, hit the emergency icon. It pulls up the instruction, walks them right over to where they need to be. Then they follow the dots and the lines on the floor right over to the valve that is tagged and named, and they shut it off. And again, never been to the building before. It works beautifully. We have it in some of our buildings in Texas. We have it, in California, Nevada, Arizona. I know back east they're using it some. We have had great success with it. And what I always like to say, and what I'll sum up and leave you with on that, is that every building has insurance. And, when you have a leak on the 25th floor, or water loss, and that water is coming down and it's wiping out those units, and, you're having all of that damage, I always say that if I can stop it at the 12th floor or the 15th floor, the person that lives on the 14th floor would think that it was the greatest thing since sliced bread. So we like to say that it does work. We've had it used in an emergency situation, and it has saved lots of money and lots of property damage.
Thanks, Rodney. I really appreciate that. So preparing the building as best one can and educating and training the staff is really extremely important. So the next step, I believe, is how do we prepare ourselves in the event of an emergency, or in the event of a situation where our insurance policy would kick in. So now the question is, what should the association have in their policy? What are some of the key things? And Jonathan, if I'm not mistaken, over the years, certainly that has changed, right? Because situations happen, events take place, and all of a sudden, where maybe something included in the policy might not have been important 5 years ago, but based on events across the country or statewide, it was important that things were brought in and added. So maybe you can talk a little bit about what that looks like from when you sit down with a board of directors, what do you recommend that, you know, the items of coverage that are absolutely critical?
Sure. Thank you, Susan. You know, from a peril standpoint, there hasn't been a whole lot of change on the insurance policies, you know, probably in the recent decade. I think one of the last major coverage gaps that we were able to fill and the industry was able to fill is loss of revenue from maintenance fees in the event that you have a significant loss and the building is uninhabitable for a period of time. That was something that a lot of carriers didn't use to cover, but we've worked within the industry to make sure that gap has been closed. One of the biggest issues that we've seen recently is just the associations being forced to take on more risk. We've been in a hard insurance market for a period now, and specifically in the Houston area with wind and hail and named storm claims, Dallas with hail claims, but mainly with water damage claims. That's been really sort of the big issue that's been driving the market lately. And what's happened is the carriers have responded by increasing water damage deductibles, which has forced associations to figure out strategies and figure out ways to deal with it. It also makes what Rodney was discussing that much more important, because again, this is now more risk that's being taken on by the association, and they therefore have to figure out how to manage it. But you know, the policy forms, I'm glad Emily was able to join us today. AFM is really a leader in this space, particularly high-rise condominiums. They have one of the broadest forms in the marketplace, and you know, from a coverage gap standpoint, I feel like everything is pretty secure and pretty well nailed down. It's taking on more risk that's becoming a bigger and bigger issue.
And so, Jonathan, when you talk about that a little bit, you know, I think 10 or 15 years ago, and Sean certainly deals with his properties as well, with the board of directors and reviewing policies, and you know, the deductibles have, you know, just quadrupled, right? I mean, I remember when a water damage deductible was $10,000, right? And then today it's you know, $50,000 to $100,000. And is there anything that an association can do, or is there anything that, you know, the board can proactively affect or put into place that would assist those deductibles? And maybe that's a question for Emily, I'm not sure.
Yeah, and it I think it's probably more a question for me, but what I think the boards should be doing is they need to be getting a strategy of how are we going to handle these deductibles. What the Texas Uniform Condominium Act says is it says that if a claim is under a deductible, then the claim is treated as though the association has no insurance, and the party who would be responsible for repairs in the absence of insurance effectively pays the claim. For the most part, hopefully that's going to be the unit owner's insurance policy that they'll step in and pay it. But for claims that are over the deductible, what the Uniform Condominium Act says is it says that in order to determine who is responsible for a deductible, you first look to the declarations. If the declarations are silent, which to be honest, most are, it says that the board may pass a resolution you know, setting forth a policy of who's responsible for the deductible. And if there's neither of those first two things, then the deductible becomes a common expense. And I think, you know, one of the issues is, you know, the boards just need to figure out what their policy should be with regard to these deductibles. And there's pros and cons. It's a difficult issue because there's pros and cons to a lot of different ways. The other thing it says that if a unit owner is negligent in causing a claim, the association may assess a deductible back against the unit owner. That's actually a pretty straightforward scenario, because in that case, the unit owner's liability policy should kick in and pay that deductible on behalf of that unit owner. But if there's a situation where just a pipe breaks inside of a wall and causes damage to a unit or several units below, that's not necessarily negligence, and a general liability policy isn't necessarily going to pay that claim because, the unit owner maybe had no reason to know that there was a defective pipe or a pipe had corroded or anything like that. There's no way to inspect it. So to be honest, there's not a lot of clear answers in that, but I do think it really helps the boards to set out a policy to say, how are we going to handle these deductibles? And what is going to be our policy going forward? And, how can we do this equitably where if someone just happens to have an unfortunate event in their unit, they don't get hit with a burdensome $50,000 assessment when, their insurance may not cover that. So that's something, it's an emerging issue just over the last several years. We've been talking to several association attorneys about, their thoughts on it and how best to handle it. But it's something that's generally not addressed by the declarations, but that the associations, or the boards, it's a good idea to get ahead of, because that is the number one type of claims we're seeing right now is water damage claims and high rises. It's really what's driving the market right now.
Yeah, and Sean, I know you've dealt with this quite a bit as well, but when that water does come streaming
yes.
down into multiple units, there's immediately who's responsible, and then the question becomes, what does my personal policy cover, and what does the association's policies cover? And again, maybe there's just a little bit of insight, but Sean, you might want to just touch on when water starts leaking, what are kind of the top 3 things that you do communicating with those individuals that are impacted first?
Well, I'll jump ahead a little bit and say that I am 100% Camp Rodney on this. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. We are very big on preventative maintenance, inspections, back of house, behind the scenes. We have our overnight teams at our properties kind of inspect everything that could leak potentially, but maybe isn't quite there yet. And another point, I just wanted to chime in on this, but there's so many systems out there right now that are water detections, they're networked systems. You can employ them building wide, and those back of house areas that you would never see, never think to check that they're leaking, you can get a notification within a couple seconds. You've got an email blast and a text alert to your team, and they can go up and respond. I say this because to your point, recently this happened at one of my properties where there was a fire. It was a fire suppression line. It broke. It burst for no real apparent reason, potentially defective. Can't say for certain at this point, but it ended up flooding 6 properties, 6 units all across 3 floors. And the team on site was able to turn off the fire pipe and the pump within 3 minutes. And we still did 6. That's the speed of what you're working at with water leaks is over the course of just a few minutes, we had 6 heavily bespoke custom units, flooded out over just that short period of time. But because of that, we prevented the subsequent 40 floors from being affected. So big on Camp Rodney and what he's proposing of just prevention and training and having your staff know where your shutoff locations are and whatnot. Now, when it comes to the actual event itself, of course, I'm very big on documentation. You need to document, take photos, try to get down to the root cause as quickly as you can so you can rectify the actual real issue. You're looping in your broker, you're looping in your insurance representative, you're looping in your attorney, potentially if there's a issue of who may be at fault or there's negligence or a third party involved or maybe a vendor involved that could potentially be in play. You want to make sure that everyone that needs to be alerted is alerted, at least as a preemptive measure, so that if anything does develop, they have firsthand knowledge. They're right there with you as you go along. And those are kind of my top big 3 is documentation, alerting everyone that you needs to know, your boards especially. Your boards often have a wealth of knowledge on them. They come from all backgrounds. Some of them have dealt with this before. I've had boards that are attorneys, that are defect litigators, that are insurance experts. You never know what you're going to have there, and they can chime in with their expertise as well and help guide the building in the direction they want to go. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, is your job when something does strike is mitigate it as much as possible, prevent it if possible before that ever happens, And then 3, document, 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 and alert everyone that could potentially be involved or may be involved in the near future.
Fantastic. Yeah. And we can't say that enough, right? And photographs, photographs, photographs. So, timelines, action items, photographs. I mean, it because you kind of think of that after, right? 3 days later, you're like, oh my gosh, we should have been taking some pictures. So, it is really, really important. And so, Jamie, when it comes to, associations that are coming up for renewal, sort of what are some of the some of the advice that you would provide when an association is seeking out either a renewal or they want to maybe possibly look at a new company for coverage?
So that's kind of a multi-pronged question there, Susan. So we'll kind of take it one level at a time there. We're talking about a renewal and or even marketing your account because maybe you're looking for a new carrier, you're looking to save some premium. Depending on your broker, they can handle that all for you. One of the things I am seeing that associations, especially high-rise, should be aware of is carriers, as of late, are really looking at those values, the values of the buildings. So, our buildings, they want to make sure that they've had an appraisal in the past, I would say 2 years. Much before that, with the change of inflation lately, with the cost of goods, the cost of labor going up, much over 2 years is somewhat old in these days. We used to take them much older than that, but I would say 2 years. That's one thing you need to be prepared for, is to have that conversation with your broker, with your carrier, looking at those values. And the other avenue is going to be if you've had some sort of loss, being able to walk through with your broker and with your carrier, how that was handled, what you did to mitigate it as quick as you could, to mitigate those damages. That's going to be very important too.
So talk about mitigation. Let's talk to Harley for a minute, right? Because when we really think about, and Rodney mentioned it, what the damage is, and I know we keep referring back to water leaks, but it could be anything, right? It could be a fire, it could be, unfortunately, it could be, loss of life, and whatever that recovery effort looks like. Harley, do you want to talk a little bit about, first on site? They arrive, just the importance of immediate communication to that restoration company. And, again, this goes back to how do we set ourselves up and train our staff in the beginning? Like, what is that list, or what is that hot sheet, or, who are our list of vendors that we just pull out and we know who to call? And it really needs to be, maybe not even just a list of those that we call, but to really know which company is the board of directors guiding us to make that phone call to first. Because if you have multiple vendors representing multiple trades to support any kind of a claim, it can get, a little messy sometimes. But Harley, I'm gonna turn it over to you.
No, yeah, thank you, Susan. I do believe, Susan, you and I have probably seen a variety of each type of peril and maybe a few more that we didn't even expect. But you're right. Everything starts with a phone call. It's very important for us to know who is engaging our services so that we can begin mitigation immediately. Our teams are commercial specific teams. Our teams are trained in the commercial and industrial environment exclusively. We don't offer in private residential service. So our teams are already very well versed in what we're going to do when we show up to the building. It is imperative to us that we're connected with the decision maker. We do realize in this particular model that the damage could be several different people's responsibility. It could be individual homeowners. It could be back to the association. It could be a building riser line, something that is specifically excluded or not the individual, unit owner's responsibility. But the most important thing is when there's water on the ground or there's smoke in the air, that we just need to start the basis of mitigation, get the water up, get an assessment, and get the building to a sustainable position so that then accurate and adequate decisions can be made. We don't like to rush in and start performing demolition or moving people out. In your particular market, you've got a lot of different homeowners. They all have content items. Some of them have very high-end content. So to go in and to begin any type of aggressive manipulation is just over the top. So really just initially it's who are we going to be working with, and what are the basic steps of mitigation to prevent the loss from going down additional floors. We come loaded with a lot of different equipment, everything from aqua boom to start booming off doors. If we do have an active pipe leak, we've had those happen before where the shutoff valve is malfunctioning, the water is still flowing. We come with a variety of water diverters so that we can start sending it down a stairwell, keeping it out of occupied areas. We can start whatever diversion is necessary from above the ceiling and from coming out of the ground. So we come loaded with a lot of mitigation tactics. You'll note from the beginning when a call is placed to us, I know, Susan, a lot of times we talk direct. First On Site does own its call center. They operate out of Fort Worth. They are all in-house employees, so they know you when you're calling. They pull your record up immediately. They know exactly where the assets are because we're very diligent at keeping track of where we have exposure at. The teams are going to get dispatched immediately. First Service Residential is set up as a Go client. So we're going to immediately dispatch the loss. You're not going to get asked a bunch of questions, just what the address is and who the primary contact is. And then the teams are going to make contact as they're headed your way. So that's why it's important for us to know the point of contact so that when we get there, we're talking to a decision maker. It can be a very intense moment. There can be 13 floors underwater or an entire first floor. It can be, very intense. So our job is to just get the basics covered and then allow a more collective decision to be made past that. As we know, disasters don't happen between 8 and 5. They like to happen at 2 in the morning or, noon on a Saturday when nobody is necessarily in the building, and damage can, during those hours, tend to be worse. So getting that phone call made quickly is very important. Water typically wicks up drywall roughly 1 inch an hour until it hits saturation. And that can be a difference between drying a series of walls out or removing them. And just to share, some of the struggle, we are also on the other side of the insurance claim. We go through a lot heavier audit than we ever have in the last 25 years. So our documentation, our daily field reporting, the readings we take, the progress we take, the tick sheets that we keep are all done electronically through a software that we developed called Bolt. We're able to give real-time burn rates to the adjuster. If it's a large loss, it may be a $25,000, $50,000, $100,000 a day burn rate. Susie, we've been on some large losses like the garage collapse, and the software that we developed gives those accurate burn rates, daily consumption, so that we can extrapolate a cost out for the adjuster, as that seems to be the first order of business for a lot of them is what is the carrier's exposure. So we spent a lot of time and a lot of money developing a software that was real time. And on the flip side, for the insurance representatives on the phone, we do track loss with our clients and can turn around and provide data back on what losses occurred that year and what type of loss, what type of peril, and all the work that we provided so that you can get some data back. We can provide it quarterly, biannual, or annual. A lot of our clients that have, like a Starbucks that has 10,000 plus locations, we're able to provide them a lot of data back on what their loss looked like and what their mitigation exposure was. So we try to work both sides as much as we can, not just provide an invoice for services, but a value add in data feedback. So that's really the nuts and bolts of what we do. But, you know, Susan, taking it back to square one, knowing who you're going to call and knowing who we're going to make contact with at the building is first order of business. For us, it does help us move quickly because once decisions are made, our guys are going to go into motion like an army of ants. They're going to get to work and they're not going to stop until it's over with whatever that looks like for that loss. So that phone call, that decision making is important on that first day.
Yeah, no question. And so when we think about then in the moment, I don't know that anyone's really kind of concerned at the moment of what this is all going to cost, because the most important thing is let's just stop it and mitigate it and get things somewhat settled, right, before we kind of go to that next stage. And so, Emily, from your standpoint, when you come into a building in the after or during or at the beginning of an event, sort of what is your role and what is your expectation from the board of directors or from the on-site team of how you put together, you know, what the next step is of recovery?
Well, I'm usually not the first one that goes in. Usually you call the loss and one of our adjusters makes a phone call and then discusses with the point of contact how extensive it is. And depending on what they say, they usually will try to get on site as soon as possible, or at least talk to the restoration company to agree to a scope of work. The one thing I always want to say is that we're there to help make you whole as soon as possible. That's part of our claims adjuster's job. The other thing I wanted to say is please don't ever let the money be the question of what you're doing, because we have a nice bank account that we can make advancements to. If we go into an account and we see that there's this substantial loss and it's going to be, you know, $1 million, and we know for a fact it's going to be like that, that's a lot of money for a condo association to have in their bank account to kind of start paying the bills. So that's one of the things you should just ask the claims adjuster about, and they can give you an advance payment. And so we're the ones, you know, starting to pay the bills, or we can pay the, you know, some of them directly or not. But talk to the adjuster. They're there to help you. They're not there to be the police, but they're there to help you get back to whole as soon as possible.
Perfect. And, you know, I will just say that I always am very, very confident when the high-rise properties have you as the individuals that come in. You know, of the recent claims that we've done, your team is absolutely phenomenal.
Well, thank you very much.
And I think it's important, right, that you have that relationship. It's all based on that relationship, communication, you know, transparency. You know, we can't really talk about that enough. So now it's, you know, things are settling down a little bit, and now, you know, we have to kind of settle with the claim, and the association owes X amount of dollars and doesn't have that money. Then there is those opportunities to go out for loan. And I'm going to turn it over to Carla, because I'm always like picking up the phone to Carla and saying, okay, now what do we do, Carla?
Yeah. So there are different scenarios, right? Obviously, those condos associations that have, you know, reserve funds or contingency funds, you know, kind of rainy day funds, that's terrific. But there are those situations where possibly, you know, the insurance claim has been put in, but the proceeds, you know, they're waiting for the proceeds to arrive, or they have to cover a deductible. And typically, if the money's not there, then they'd have to issue either they'd have to do a special assessment, and that in and of itself could take a lot of time. And so a lot, you know, these lines of credits or loans are a good sort of quick fix to kind of patch that in between period. So we have helped some associations with lines of credit just to get them through that period to be able to have the work done while they wait for the rest of the proceeds to arrive, or while they eventually wait to, potentially either issue that special assessment to repay the loan, or maybe just even increase the regular assessment to repay it. But we will work with the board to structure sort of the different options available, and sort of what's the fastest option, or what's the best option for that specific need.
Perfect. So I think, when an event happens, there's a lot of folks that are sort of working behind the scene, a lot of collaborative work together to obviously make this, the recovery as quick as possible. But then there's this other side, right? There's this other side of, oh my gosh, what's happening at that building? Let's call the front desk agent. Let's get with the manager. Let's ask residents what's happening. And so all of a sudden, where you and the board of directors and the community feel they have it all under control, there's a lot of naysayers around that want to make a story out of it, right? And so recently we had an event where Dee Dee came in and really helped us control that communication and make certain that we were certainly distributing factual information and making sure that it didn't turn into, just a negative or really kind of a bad feeling about the association or the property or the building or the people that at hand that we're trying to resolve. So Dee Dee, I'm going to turn it over to you. You're one of the most important SMEs on the call today of, how do we handle crisis communication?
Thank you, Susan. You're right. What do? You manage the message. And there's a saying out there, prepare for the worst so you can be your best. And there's another saying, Noah built the ark while the sun was shining. So in other words, what can you do before anything happens to make sure that when and if something happens, you're not in the deer in the headlights mode, that your adrenaline's not going crazy and you don't know what to do, but that you know exactly what to do. So what is a catastrophic event in the high-rise world? First thoughts that come to mind are the ones we really don't like to think about, like the building collapses, fires, loss of human life, and more. But really, a catastrophe is anything that can ding or hurt a reputation. And we all know that a damaged reputation and loss of trust stemming from one event can damage the reputation or the asset for a lifetime. And you want to avoid that. So what do? Why and how do you get in front of crises? And of course, what do you do when something happens? Your goals are always, when something happens, to be right there on the ground, to communicate externally and internally. By externally, I mean clearly to media, because in these days, especially, it's lightning rod fast. There's a saying, a lie can be halfway around the world while the truth is still putting its shoes on. And you want to make sure that you get right in front of all that. So you want to be able to call someone who can immediately glom and collaborate with your board and your property management company, First Service Residential. We've worked together on several occasions to get out there with a statement right away. Everything you know at that time. This happened. This is what we're doing to take care of it. We're going to keep you updated. You want to communicate. Sean earlier said document. I say communicate. You want to, again, the communications person has got to be lockstep with the board and with the property management company to know exactly what's going on and when. So you have the external, you want to speak to media, you want to convey truth. Your whole goal in all of the communications you do is to convey assurance, confidence, transparency, compassion, so that you can, in the end, you want to protect, preserve, even enhance your reputation. If handled well, you can actually enhance your reputation. You never want people to say they didn't know what they were doing. right? You want people to say they knew exactly what to do, and I'm gonna tell all my friends to rent that or to buy at XYZ high rise because they knew what to do when something happened. What can you do before anything happens? There are several key things. Number one, and Rodney referred to this as well, you establish your emergency response team. That is the board, has to have some legal representation, whether it's from the board or outside, has to have a communications arm, and of course, in this case, First Service Residential, Susan and her team, and the insurance, all the key elements there. So that when something happens, you know exactly how to communicate and how to contact each other. You get together, you assess the situation, you go over the facts, you decide what you want to do or what you need to say, how you want to manage your message, talk about the consequences of your statements, of your messages. You get in front of it, you think through it. In the case of a situation I recently worked on, from an internal perspective, you also want to communicate to the residents and owners very frequently. So that's another reason why the communications person has to be lockstep, shoulder to shoulder with the board and with the emergency response team, so you can communicate out and internally to your owners, residents, out to the media when needed. Sometimes with media, you're proactive when something happens and then you're reactive if you get questions. But internally, it's pretty nonstop depending on the situation. A case study we just recently dealt with in Houston, for a period of a little over a month, we had daily communications, giving updates, always with a consistent message. Here are the updates, here's what's new. We developed FAQs, a list of questions that we both got and that we anticipated, so that we could all speak with one voice and communicate the FAQs out for people who had questions. We want to be accessible and visible always. We also, depending on the situation, the severity of the situation, town hall meetings are important. I've dealt with that several years ago. There was a fire in a high rise in Houston. People were out of the building for a while. We had town hall meetings in the virtual world, in the digital post-COVID world. We have Zoom town hall meetings. You want to prepare. You want to, again, make sure that when people are done hearing from you, and we're talking now about owners and residents, they think, I am in good hands. You never want the opposite, because that will be the catastrophe when you lose your reputation, your trust, and the asset is severely affected. What can go wrong? That's a really good question. Once you have the situation and you're continuing communications with each other, think through all the things that could go wrong. There was a recent situation in Houston, not a First Service residential property, but a friend, of course I won't mention names. The elevators went out over the weekend and it wasn't communicated. And this was a building where there were some elderly people. Who's there to help decide what to do? What's a contingency plan? So you always want to think ahead. You always want to think clearly. You always want to be proactive. In this era of social media, that's obviously something to keep in mind. You want someone monitoring social media. It's really important up front to develop your foundational messaging. Here's what happened. Here's how we're handling it. Here's the timeline, etc. So that you can, even if it means repeating it, the most effective form of advertising is to hear something 3 times, right? So you repeat your message that you have developed and that's been approved, and you come across as consistent, calm, trustworthy, etc. So again, the role communications plays, all of you are right on top of handling the actual event or situation. It's important to handle also the impact of the event or situation, because that's where the reputation comes out. Another thing that we learned in Houston in a recent situation, how about other neighboring high rises? There's buzz going on. You can be mindful about your own owners and residents being your best advocates for your building. If you handle it well, and First Service Residential handled this recent one very well. The residents and owners turn into some of the best advocates because they're out there on the streets, people are asking questions, and they were able to say, here's what's happening, here's when we're back, here's what's going on, because the communication worked well. So again, the phrases, the quotes that I love, I use all the time, take with you, is when is the best time to plan? Now. Noah built the ark while the sun was shining. Build your plan, build your approach, build your response team while the sun is shining, and prepare for the worst so you can be your best.
Yeah, and I think, you know, Dee Dee, you just hit on so many areas that are so important. And but the communication piece, I know that with the garage collapse and with the building evacuation, that daily communication, it always went out at the same time every day, because you can imagine the number of questions and the number of emails and phone calls, depending on how large that building is, will be going to the general manager, and you want to be able to answer those questions in advance and be consistent, and you're telling the same thing to everyone at the same time. So, you know, that's really critical. So I'm just kind of looking through some of the questions that have come up, and I just have two that we really didn't touch on. And then, you know, if there's anything else that anyone wants to kind of close with. But when you talk about insurance requirements, and, you know, I think, I'm not sure who brought it up, Jonathan, you may have in the beginning, but, you know, building evaluations today are becoming more and more common. And so maybe let's just talk about how important the valuation of a building is, and, you know, how a board goes about getting that done, if they don't already have that done. So I don't know who might want to take that, Sarah, if that's something that you want to kind of address.
Yeah, I think that's a good question for Sarah. Sarah just coordinated, you know, providing proposals for, and she can explain, but providing appraisal proposals for our first service high rises. So go ahead, Sarah.
Sure, thanks. So one of the reasons why building valuations are so important, even though total losses aren't all that common, and they are common, obviously it's important to make sure you can put your building back the way it was. Building appraisals can help one get good pictures of your building, of your equipment, and all of the good things you're doing from a safety perspective. It can also confirm some of your exposure, like square footage. And lastly, most importantly, it can provide a recommended building replacement cost. And so over the past few years, when we've been faced in a hard market and we're seeing rate increases, that's fallen to the wayside. You don't really want to take on a rate increase and then also increase the limit on your insurance, because you're getting hit twice with extra costs that maybe you didn't anticipate. And so with these building valuations, it's an opportunity to correct what maybe hasn't been updated over the past few years, and give your board, your unit owners, your residents peace of mind that if something really catastrophic did happen, that you'll be prepared, and that you can actually put your building back the way it was before. Getting these appraisals done can go a number of different ways. Gallagher has a sister company called Gallagher Bassett that offers appraisals. There's also numerous appraisal companies that we can assist with coordinating appraisals. And so with that, I say the most important things are to prepare and time for an appraisal, because it doesn't happen overnight. It's in high demand. And so you need to be sure that if an appraisal is offered, you jump on it. And then secondly, that if the appraisal does come back, you're prepared to deal with those results. Because in some situations, we may be significantly undervalued. And then we will still work with the insurance company. For example, Emily does a great job with us on working with our associations on getting them to the right value, but not necessarily bankrupting them to get there. And so it's a delicate process on getting enough insurance and making sure that everyone is covered.
Thank you, Sarah. Appreciate that. So we've talked about insurance coverage for the property, the association. We touched a little bit on, you know, what is a homeowner, what does a resident need for insurance? And I know that a lot of our brokers have made visits to our properties to meet with the residents to give some direction and advice of personal personal insurance coverage. One thing we didn't touch on that I'm just going to mention, but certificates of insurance from any vendor that comes into the property, absolutely critical, because although we've talked a lot today about events that happen that are sort of self-started through the building, we've certainly known of vendors that come in and maybe hit a sprinkler head, and obviously we want to make sure that any vendor that comes on site or slip and fall, or that we have that proper coverage for all of our vendors as well. So that's something that I would recommend to all the board of directors, is just to make sure, what is that policy, what is the coverage that you're requiring, and what is that procedure for the on-site staff. So I want to thank everyone. We've had such great conversation today. This is a little bit of a different format. We don't have a live audience, if you will, to ask questions. We wanted to certainly put together a conversation and a presentation for those of you that had an interest to attend our event in Austin. This, certainly is available for you, and hopefully will, in our next event, we will see you personally, and appreciate that. So good night to everyone. And again, thank you so much to all of our SMEs.
Thank you.
Thank you.